Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Okay, great. Today, we're going to be looking into something pretty incredible.
Okay.
We're talking about superflares.
Hmm.
These massive bursts of energy from the sun, the kind that make even the most intense auroras we've seen look like tiny little flickers.
Wow.
We're diving into this fascinating article from the Max Planck Institute for Solar System Research.
Oh, cool.
It's from December 18th, 2024, and it's titled, "The Sun's Hidden Fury. Violent Superflares Are Surprisingly Frequent."
The Sun's Hidden Fury. That's a pretty intense title.
Right. It definitely caught my eye, and it got me thinking, what if those beautiful auroras we all love are actually a warning sign of something way bigger and potentially way more destructive?
That's an interesting thought. We tend to think of the sun as this constant, reliable source of light and warmth.
Yeah, for sure.
But the truth is, it's way more dynamic and powerful.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think those intense solar storms we saw this year really drove that point home.
Definitely.
I mean, those auroras were reaching down to some pretty low latitudes. But what if those were just like a small taste of what the sun can really do? That's what this article has me thinking about.
Right. It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This article actually talks about evidence from ancient tree rings and glacial ice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Which are basically like natural time capsules, recording the sun's activity over thousands of years. They show us that these extreme solar events have definitely happened in the past. But it's like having a puzzle with a few pieces missing. We can see these events happened, but figuring out exactly how often is tricky.
So how do scientists even begin to fill in those missing pieces? We can't go back in time and just, watch the sun for thousands of years.
Right. That's where things get really clever. They look to other stars,
Oh, interesting.
ones that are very similar to our sun, in size, temperature, brightness.
Okay, so like solar twins.
Exactly, solar twins. By studying these twins, we can get a glimpse into how our own sun might behave over long periods.
Oh, that's pretty clever. So it's kind of like using these other stars as stand-ins to see what our sun might be capable of over thousands of years.
Yeah, exactly. And for this study, they used data from the Kepler Space Telescope.
Oh, wow. Kepler, okay.
Yeah, the one that observed thousands of stars.
Yeah.
They actually narrowed their focus to about 56,000 stars that were really similar to our sun.
Okay, so they found their solar twins, but what exactly were they looking for in these stars?
They were looking for superflares.
Oh, okay, the superflares. And what did they find?
Well, what they found was pretty surprising. These sun-like stars, they experience superflares roughly once per century.
Whoa. Okay, hold on. Once a century. That doesn't sound very reassuring, especially considering we're talking about events that are, hundreds of times stronger than the biggest solar storms we've ever seen?
Yeah, you're right to be a little concerned. Think about the Carrington event back in 1859.
Whoa.
That was one of the most powerful solar storms in recorded history, right? Wreaked havoc on telegraph systems worldwide.
Totally.
Now imagine that, but magnified 100 times. That's what a superflare could unleash.
Wow, that's a really sobering thought. Okay, so these superflares, they happen roughly every 100 years, and the last major one was the Carrington event in 1859.
Right.
Are we overdue?
It's definitely a question worth considering.
Yeah, and what would that mean for us today? I mean, think about it. Our world runs on technology.
Right, and that makes us extremely vulnerable. If a superflare were to hit Earth today, the consequences could be absolutely devastating.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, a superflare 100 times stronger than the Carrington event hits us tomorrow. What are we talking about here? What would that look like?
Well, just think about everything that relies on electricity.
Yeah.
And delicate electronics.
Yeah.
Satellites, power grids, communication networks.
Right.
All incredibly vulnerable. We could see widespread blackouts, disruptions to GPS, communication systems down, damage to satellites. It would be chaotic, to say the least. And the economic cost, astronomical.
So it's not just about some pretty auroras in the sky. We're talking about potential global chaos.
Exactly. We are so much more reliant on technology today than we were back in 1859. And that makes us way more susceptible to the effects of something like a superflare.
Okay, this is a lot to take in. So if we know these superflares are a real threat, what are we doing about it? Can we even predict them?
Well, that's where space weather forecasting comes in. It's kind of like predicting hurricanes, but for space.
Oh, interesting.
And just like with hurricanes, the earlier we know a major solar storm is coming, the better we can prepare.
So we've got people like constantly monitoring the sun, trying to give us a heads up if something big is brewing.
Absolutely. There's a network of satellites and ground-based observatories that keep a constant watch on the sun. They provide real-time data on solar flares, coronal mass ejections, these massive bursts of plasma and magnetic field from the sun's corona and other activity.
Okay, and all of this data helps scientists predict when a superflare might be headed our way.
That's the goal. Scientists use this data to create models and make predictions. But honestly, accurately forecasting these events, especially the really big ones, it's still a work in progress. The sun is a very complex system, and we're still learning about the physics that drive these events.
So it's a constant race to improve our forecasting abilities before the next big one hits.
You could say that, but there are some exciting things coming up. The ESA's Vigil probe, it's set to launch in 2031.
Okay.
And it will observe the sun from a really unique vantage point, which should give us a much earlier warning system for potentially dangerous solar activity.
So in about 6 years, we'll have a new set of eyes on the sun, hopefully giving us a better heads up. That's good. But what can we do in the meantime? What can we do to protect ourselves from these, potential solar tantrums?
Well, there are a few strategies being explored. One is called hardening our infrastructure. Basically, making our power grids, satellites, and communication systems more resilient to these bursts of energy.
Okay.
Like think surge protectors, radiation shielding, building in redundant systems.
So basically building things tougher and with backup plans.
Exactly. Another approach is developing early warning systems that can trigger automatic safety protocols. For example, if a major solar storm is detected, satellites could be put into safe mode.
Okay.
Power grids could be adjusted, and critical data could be backed up.
So it sounds like a multi-pronged approach, a combination of technology and disaster preparedness.
You got it. This is a global challenge. It's going to take international collaboration and a sense of urgency to address it properly.
Okay, so we've talked about forecasting and protection at a global level. But what about us as individuals? What can we do to prepare for a potential superflare event?
That's a really important question, and it really starts with awareness. Simply understanding what a superflare is, what the impact could be, and what signs to watch for. That can make a big difference in how we react and adapt.
So knowledge is power, even when it comes to space weather. What else can we do on a personal level?
Well, it's always a good idea to have an emergency plan, and that includes for space weather events.
Right.
Think about what you would need if the power went out, or communication networks were disrupted. Having a backup power source, a supply of essentials like food and water, and a way to stay informed, even if the internet's down. These things can really help.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like the old saying, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst, especially when it comes to something as powerful and unpredictable as the sun.
Exactly. We can't control the sun, but we can control our level of preparedness.
This has been a really eye-opening look into the world of superflares. We've learned a lot, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
I agree. The sun is incredibly fascinating and powerful, and the more we learn about it, the more we realize how much more there is to learn.
Before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, let's go back to that article from the Max Planck Institute. What are some of the key takeaways our listeners should remember?
Well, one of the biggest things is that superflares might be a lot more common than we initially thought. Earlier estimates suggested they happened every few thousand years.
Right.
But this new research says it could be as often as once per century.
A century? Wow, that really changes things. I mean, most of us probably haven't even considered something like this happening during our lifetimes.
It's true, but the reality is a superflare isn't just a theory. It's a part of how the sun behaves, and we need to be ready.
Okay, so superflares are more common than we thought. What else stood out to you from the article?
I was really struck by the emphasis on the need for more research and better forecasting. We've made some progress in understanding the sun, but there's still so much we don't know.
Yeah.
We need more data, better models, and better international collaboration to really improve our ability to predict and prepare for these events.
It sounds like a call to action for scientists and policymakers to really take this seriously.
Right.
We need to invest in the research and infrastructure to protect ourselves from these potentially devastating events.
Absolutely. This isn't just an academic exercise. It's a matter of global importance.
Okay, so we've established that superflares are a real threat, and we've got work to do to get ready. But let's not forget, the sun is also the source of all life on Earth. It's this complex and awe-inspiring force that we're only beginning to understand.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's both life-giving and potentially destructive. And as we learn more about it, we need to approach it with both respect and a sense of wonder.
Well said. Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll explore in more detail what we can do to protect ourselves from these superflares and how we can build a more resilient future in the face of this incredible solar power.
So, picking up where we left off, let's imagine for a second that a superflare, something like 100 times stronger than the Carrington event, were to hit us tomorrow.
Okay.
What do you think we would actually see?
Honestly, it's kind of frightening to even think about. We talked about the potential impact on like power grids, satellites, communication networks, all that.
Right.
But what would that actually look like for like people on the ground?
Well, in the short term, we'd probably see widespread blackouts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, as power grids get overloaded and just fail. I mean, imagine entire cities plunged into darkness, traffic lights out, hospitals struggling to keep essential systems running.
Wow.
It would be pretty chaotic.
It sounds like a disaster movie, honestly.
It kind of does, yeah.
But what about like longer term effects? What happens after the initial blackout?
That's where things get even more complex. A superflare could mess with GPS systems, which we use for everything these days. Navigation, financial transactions, you name it. Communication networks could be down, which means coordinating any kind of emergency response would be incredibly difficult. Even just staying in touch with loved ones would be a challenge.
So we're talking about a potential breakdown in like the basic systems that keep our world running.
Exactly. And the economic consequences, huge. I mean, think about the cost of repairing everything, the lost productivity, the disruption to global supply chains. It's a scenario no one wants to deal with.
No, definitely not. You're painting a pretty bleak picture here.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious about like the more personal side of things. How would a superflare actually affect our everyday lives beyond just, losing power and internet?
That's a really interesting question. I think it would force us to confront how dependent we are on technology, like really confront it. We'd have to find new ways to communicate, new ways to get around, new ways to entertain ourselves. It would be a big adjustment.
It's almost like we'd be thrown back in time in a way, forced to relearn some of those basic skills that, we've kind of lost in our modern world.
There's some truth to that, yeah.
Yeah.
It would be challenging, no doubt.
Yeah.
But it might also be a chance to, reevaluate our priorities, reconnect with what really matters.
That's an interesting way to look at it. It's like amidst all the chaos, there could be this opportunity for growth, for reflection.
Maybe. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. Hopefully we can find ways to protect ourselves and avoid that kind of catastrophic scenario altogether.
Right. Which brings us back to those protective measures we were talking about.
Right.
We talked about things like hardening infrastructure and early warning systems. Are there any other strategies in the works?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of research happening right now. For example, some scientists are exploring the idea of creating artificial magnetic fields around Earth.
Whoa, okay.
Yeah. It would be like a giant force field to deflect those charged particles from a superflare.
That sounds like something straight out of science fiction.
It does, doesn't it? And to be honest, it's a long shot.
Yeah.
There are a ton of technical challenges.
Yeah.
But it's an example of the kind of innovative thinking that's being applied to this problem.
It's pretty amazing to think about the possibilities, especially when you consider how far technology has come in just the past few decades.
Oh, for sure. And who knows what breakthroughs are coming next. We might discover completely new ways to, harness energy or even manipulate space-time itself. The potential is huge.
Okay, I love your optimism, but let's get back to the present for a minute. Given what we know about superflares and how vulnerable we are right now, what are the most important things we can do to prepare?
I think it really boils down to a few key things. First, we got to invest in research and development, improve our understanding of the sun and our ability to predict these events.
Okay.
Second, hardening our infrastructure, make it more resilient to solar storms.
Yeah.
And finally, developing strong disaster preparedness plans that include space weather scenarios.
So it sounds like a multifaceted approach. It's going to take coordination between governments, industries, even individuals.
Exactly. This isn't something any one country or organization can handle on its own. It's a global effort. We all share the responsibility to protect our planet and our future.
So it's not just about scientists and engineers in their labs. It's about all of us as citizens recognizing the threat and working together to find solutions.
You said it perfectly. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, not just with each other, but with the sun itself, the star that keeps us all alive.
Well said. And it seems like the more we learn about the sun, the more we realize how much we still don't know.
That's the beauty of science, isn't it? It's a constant journey of discovery, always pushing those boundaries of knowledge and understanding.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. From the potential devastation of a superflare to the promising technology coming up.
Right.
But I think it's also important to acknowledge the emotional, like the psychological impact of facing a threat like this.
Absolutely. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, even helpless, when you think about how powerful the sun is. But we're not powerless. We're not.
So how do we balance that sense of awe, at the sun's power with the very real threat it poses?
I think it starts by embracing a mindset of resilience, knowing that challenges are going to happen, but so is our ability to adapt, to innovate, to overcome.
So it's about focusing on what we can control, our own preparedness, our collective efforts to minimize the risks.
Exactly. And it's about having some perspective. Yes, a superflare could be disruptive, but humans have faced incredible challenges throughout history.
Right.
And we've overcome them. We're a resilient species.
Yeah.
We adapt, we innovate, even in the face of adversity.
If you look back, we've weathered some pretty intense storms, literally and figuratively.
Exactly. And that gives me hope that we can handle this too. It might not be easy, but we have the smarts, the creativity, the will to find a way forward.
I love that perspective. It's not about ignoring the potential for hardship, but it's about recognizing our strength, our ability to bounce back.
Right. And, that resilience, it often comes from our connections with each other. We're stronger together. When we face challenges as a team, when we support each other, that's where we find real strength.
It's a reminder that community is so important, especially during a crisis. Building those strong connections now, that trust, that mutual support, could make all the difference.
Couldn't agree more. Because in the end, it's not just about surviving a disaster, it's about thriving afterwards. And that takes shared purpose, believing we're all in this together and being committed to rebuilding a better future for us and for the generations after us.
That's a really powerful message. It's a reminder that while the threat of superflares is real and we need to take it seriously, it doesn't have to control us. We can choose to face this with courage, with creativity, with collaboration.
I believe that wholeheartedly. I think if we do that, we won't just survive, we'll come out of this stronger, more connected than ever.
That's a perfect way to move into the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore ways we can cultivate that resilience both individually and as a global community. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll really dive into the human side of this cosmic challenge. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of superflares. We've talked about the science, the potential impact, and the technological solutions. But as we wrap up, I want to shift gears a bit.
Okay.
I want to focus on something just as important. The human element. At the end of the day, this isn't just about protecting our stuff, right?
Right.
It's about protecting ourselves, our communities, our way of life.
I completely agree. When we talk about prepping for a superflare, we often get stuck on the physical stuff, like hardening infrastructure, early warning systems, stocking up on supplies. But there's another side to preparedness that's crucial, and that's the psychological and social aspect.
So what does that look like? How do we actually prepare ourselves mentally and emotionally for something like this?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging the threat.
Yeah.
We can't just ignore it and pretend it's not there. We need to have real conversations about the potential risks, the challenges, both personally and as a society.
That makes sense. If we don't acknowledge the problem, we can't really address it. But, thinking about a threat like this can be scary, right? How do we stop that fear from turning into panic or just, freezing up?
That's where knowledge comes in. The more we understand about superflares, the less scary they become. We can start to see them not as this random, unpredictable thing, but as a natural phenomenon, something we can study, understand, prepare for.
So it's about empowering ourselves with information, not letting fear control us.
Exactly. And with knowledge comes a sense of agency. We might not be able to control what the sun does, but we can control how we react. We can prepare our homes, learn new skills that might be useful, build stronger connections with our communities. All of that helps.
It's about focusing on what we can do, not dwelling on what we can't.
Right. And I think perspective is important too. Yes, a superflare could really disrupt our lives. But humanity has faced and overcome so many challenges throughout history. We're pretty good at adapting and innovating, even when things get tough.
It's true. We've weathered some pretty intense storms, both literally and figuratively.
Exactly. And that makes me hopeful that we can handle this too. It may not be easy, but we're resourceful. We'll find a way.
I appreciate that perspective. It's not about denying that things could get hard, but it's also about remembering our strength, our resilience.
Absolutely. And, a lot of that resilience comes from our connections with each other. We're stronger together. When we face challenges as a team, support each other, that's where we find real strength.
It's a good reminder that community is essential, especially during a crisis. Building those bonds now, that trust, that support, it could make all the difference.
Totally agree. Because ultimately, it's not just about surviving. It's about thriving after the fact. And that takes a shared sense of purpose. Believing we're in this together. And being committed to creating a better future for ourselves and for everyone who comes after us.
That's a powerful message. It's a reminder that while the threat of these superflares is real and we need to take it seriously, it doesn't have to define us. We can choose to face it head on with courage, creativity, and collaboration.
I truly believe that if we do that, we'll not only get through it, but we'll come out the other side even stronger, more connected than ever.
That's a perfect place to wrap up our deep dive, I think. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of the sun's hidden fury. We hope you found it informative, interesting, and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
It was my pleasure. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we learn about the sun, the better prepared we'll be for whatever challenges it throws at us, and the better we can use its incredible energy to benefit everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for listening, everyone.